Likewise, we can't go just ask people how they feel about ethics or what they think about ethics because, again, that's no way to investigate truths about the world. I can go take a poll about how many people think the Earth is flat, but that's not going to tell me anything about whether the Earth is flat. I have to go check its shape. So people's beliefs about what they should do doesn't help us discover ethical truths. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of empirical or experimental or ways or any sort of subject way like that we can investigate and discover ethical truths. So philosophers are just left with their arguments, many of which we're going to investigate. Um, so I think one of the most interesting things about this question, what should I do, or the question which ethics and morality deals with, is that in recent times, at least in the last 50 years, that philosophers have come to settle on or focus on three different theories to the exclusion of others. So there's widespread agreement among philosophers and among ethicists right now that our most promising and most likely to be true ethical theories is one of the three which philosophers are evenly divided across. In fact, I can give you some numbers here. There's a poll in 2009 of 1,803 professional philosophers, and we have it's about 1/3 for each. We have 24% for one, 22% for another, 22% for another, and then only 4.2 are undecided, 3.2% are accept another alternative, so one beyond these three, and only 2.7% reject all of them and presumably reject other alternatives and think ethics is bunk. So what's interesting is how one way to view that data is that philosophers are radically divided about the correct ethical theory, but I think that's the wrong lens in which to view it. What I think the correct way to think about this is that it's amazing how unified philosophers are, that while they're pretty divided about which one of these three is correct, they're in widespread agreement that the other alternatives are false, and that one of these three is the correct ethical theory. So what are these three ethical theories? Well, the first I'll talk about is called consequentialism or utilitarianism. That goes by a couple names. And what they're focused on, the first name is more suggestive, right? Consequentialism. They're focused on consequences and performing actions that maximize good consequences and minimize bad consequences. So usually the good is taken to be something like pleasure or happiness, and the bad is taken to be suffering or unhappiness. So when I'm faced with the question of what should I do, the way that they would answer that question is they'd look at the consequences of all the actions available to me, and they'd say, well, I would need to consider which ones would maximize happiness and minimize suffering, and whichever one would produce the most happiness over and without minus the, divided or minus by the suffering, that's the action I should perform. So they answer the question of what should I do by first looking at what's good in the world, and then they think the answer of the question of what should I do is just answered by whatever produces the most good. So those are the consequentialists or the utilitarians. The next view I'm going to talk about real quickly is deontology or Kantian ethics. This is another one of those positions that has two names, and it was discovered or sort of discovered or elaborated on, or its most prominent advocate is Kant, which is why his name is sort of still attached to it. Of course, we're not just interested in the history. We don't really just want to know what Kant thought. We're interested in this line of theory which sort of begins with Kant and has been built upon and revised and improved upon since he's been gone. So we're not just interested in what some old dusty book tells us, but we're interested in this live theory which philosophers are trying to improve upon and figure out if it's correct. So Kantian ethics or deontology, they don't look at consequences at all. They think consequences are entirely the wrong way to make decisions about what should I do. Instead, they think that we need to look to what our duty is and what rules or obligations we have. So they're not going to be looking at the consequences for what max. In fact, they would be perfectly happy causing a lot of suffering, reducing the amount of happiness in the world, if that's the action which a justified rule dictates that they should perform. So while a utilitarian would be perfectly happy lying to someone to maximize happiness, a Kantian, although Kantians do allow lying in some cases, it depends on the rule. But a Kantian would be more inclined not to lie, right? Because they're not going to care about the fact that this lie is going to make a lot of people happy. They're more concerned with this rule that tells them not to lie. Now, they don't have a rule that just says don't lie. It's a much more complicated rule than that. But they are focused on the rule rather than the consequences. That's my point. There are sort of two rules that they have, and one is very similar to the golden rule, but it's a little different. It's when you're performing an action for a goal, make sure that this action could be the universal way of accomplishing that goal. And we'll go into more about that later. And the other rule is very similar, and it's that basically don't use people. It's treat others as ends, not as mere means. So I can't lie to you, because that would be treating you as a tool to get something I want, rather than getting you to freely choose to give it to me by offering you $10 or asking you to give it to me or something along those lines. In which case I would not be merely using you to get what I want, because I would also be respecting your free choice. Another contrast between the Kantians and the deontologists and the utilitarians is not just that the utilitarians and the consequentialists are focused on consequences and the Kantians are focused on rules. It's that they think that different things are of value. A utilitarian is going to say that happiness is what's good and unhappiness is what's bad. But there's only one good and only one bad, and everything else reduces to it, right? So health is good because it brings us happiness. Football is good because it brings us happiness. Family is good because it brings us happiness, right? They think that they're a monistic theory of value because there's only one good. Utilitarians are also, or Kantians, Kantians and deontologists are also monists about value. They think that the one value is the capacity to make free choices. So it's this human ability. The way they put it is humanity is the one good. And by humanity, they mean our capacity to make free choices, our freedom from our desires, and our ability to make a decision. No matter how much I desire for something, to stand back and lay down or decide for reasons about what I'm going to do. So that's one of the reasons. So there's going to be the contrast between the utilitarians and the Kantians on not only about what matters, consequences or rules, but also on what is of value, happiness or the capacity to make free choices. And that will also generate lots of differences in the results that those two theories produce. The last theory, in one way, is the oldest, and in another way is the youngest. The virtue ethics is an ethical theory which was pretty much universally accepted among the ancient Greeks, but then was pretty much entirely went away and was forgotten about until about the late 1950s, and now it's come back with a vengeance. And what the virtue ethicists want to do is say that there's a problem that the utilitarians are focused on what action you need to perform, and so they look to the consequences of the action and they try to determine whether this is the action I should perform. And same thing with the Kantians, right? They're concerned with what action I should perform, and they're looking for a rule or something along those lines to figure out what I need to do. The virtue ethicists think we need to instead look to character traits and what makes a good life, right? They're interested in not what I should do, but in what makes a good life. And they think that what you should do is just, and they think that what makes a good life, let me backtrack a little bit. What they think makes a good life is a little bit of luck, but also possessing certain virtuous character traits like honesty, charity, generosity, and other things which don't sound as moral, wittiness, resourcefulness, things along those lines, right? And they think that those sorts of things go into being a successful human, right? And they think that as far as the question of what you should do, well, you should do whatever the virtuous person would do. So you should do what the honest person would do, or what the courageous person would do, or what the resourceful person would do, or the witty person would do. But they're not so much focused on the question of what should I do, but instead focused on someone's character traits and what makes a good human life, a successful or admirable human life. It's not so. It differs quite a bit from the other two ethical theories, but it's sort of hard to capture unless we go into detail. So I'll cut it off at there. But the sort of contrast I want to draw between the three is that you've got one that's focused on consequences, one that's focused on rules, and one that's focused on character. And that's a nice way to try thinking about these three theories we've got. I think that's all I want to say. So I think I've introduced you to the three. I'd ask for questions, but clearly that won't be very successful.